Board games and board game expansions. That is what we are going to explore in this podcast. And really the ultimate question is, from the board gaming perspective, can you have too much of a good thing? When do certain expansions become too much, and when do they start to take away from the narrative of the board game? When do they start to kind of break down the rules and put those stress points on where you find yourself spending more time figuring out rules and looking up rules than actually rolling the dice or playing the game? And in this podcast, I'm going to explore this question from the perspective of Talisman, because I love Talisman. It's one of the longest playing games that I continue to play. There's a lot of very, very interesting and good memories with this game. And if you're familiar with it, it has lots and lots of expansions. It takes the core game, Talisman, it takes a respectable core game and honestly essentially just blasts it out to this massive, massive game, potentially full of bloat. Those of you who play Descent First Edition or even Second Edition, maybe it comes to a close second or third. Use it as a template to explore, or at least answer the questions, because certainly being a completionist and you have a game that you enjoy, you want to get the expansions, even if you're not quite ready to play them, because ultimately these things go out of print and they become harder and harder to find. But it's good to know when to kind of dial it up or dial it down based on what you're looking on. So the primary expansions with Talisman, they come in small boxes and big boxes. And all the expansions add new characters to play with. Some new figures, some new skills, some new cards. A baseline expansion that adds more monsters to the game or more heroes to the game to play, that's an auto-include. That's going to make your tactics a lot bigger. That's going to keep the experience of the game fresh and new, because even if you've explored it and you know the winning tactics, now you can try it with additional characters. The games that I enjoy with expansions, Talisman, Runebound, I like to incorporate and play different characters, even though I have my set stable of characters that I like and that I enjoy. Then we move on to the big box expansions in Talisman, and these add literally new realms to explore, new sideboards. It takes the game, the footprint of the game, adding the highlands, the city, the woodlands, and the dungeon, a lot more to do, a lot more to see, but a lot more real estate to explore. Naturally, it adds new cards, new encounters, new items, but the challenge with these bigger box expansions is not only does it push out the table, it could, depending on the narrative of the game, make the game last that much longer, because now the players, yourself included, you have so much more to explore. You have new areas to explore, new things to kind of check out and figure out. Does that take you away from the core win condition of the game, or does it offer another aspect? The challenge here naturally is to go all in and set them all up, and from the perspective of Talisman, that's how we usually play all of the sideboards, all of the big expansions, but you could dial it down a little bit. With Descent Second Edition, often we'll play core if it's new players, but then if it's returning players, or the group is looking for a little bit more of a challenge, we'll all agree and take one of the big box expansions and incorporate that in. We won't kind of overwhelm it. Now, the big challenge in any board game, new mechanics. And we see this in Talisman in that there are cards in the Firelands that let you destroy spaces. There's a night and day mechanic which modifies certain monsters and certain events. You might see this in another type of board game where it adds layers of complexity over the rules, either new character classes, leveling up, maybe effects like poison or magic. I'm a little bit hesitant with these type of expansions that incorporate the rules, because yes, they might push the game out to be a little bit more realistic, but if I feel like the core game was satisfying enough, once you start tossing in rules, additional layers, it is definitely going to slow the game down. It's definitely going to slow down the mechanics, because ultimately they might be good ideas, but honestly, especially if it's a good title, especially if it's a good game, if it was that important to have these rules, they would have been included in the core. it's, I don't want to say an afterthought, but kind of a 1.5 or a 1.6 type release as opposed to a 2.0 type release on there. And I'm very hesitant to toss these into the game. So from Talisman, we will use the cards from the Firelands, in terms of the items and the monsters and the characters that you can play. But the mechanic of burning spaces and navigating that, we often leave them out. The mechanic of night and day, we'll leave that out on there. And that, again, that's not to say you can't play with them, but that's the first thing that I would cut if I was looking to keep the game reasonable, and the last thing I would add if I was looking for that experience.